In the early morning hours of June 17, 1972, 5 men were arrested inside the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C. They were caught with burglary tools, cameras, and electronic surveillance equipment. What seemed like a simple break-in would eventually bring down the most powerful man in America and forever change how Americans viewed their government. The arrested men weren't ordinary burglars. They were well-dressed, carried large amounts of cash, and one of them, James McCord, was the security coordinator for President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign. The Washington Post assigned 2 relatively unknown reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, to cover what their editors assumed would be a minor local crime story. They had no idea they were about to uncover the biggest political scandal in American history. President Nixon was running for re-election in 1972, and by all accounts, he was expected to win easily. He had achieved significant foreign policy successes, including opening diplomatic relations with China and pursuing détente with the Soviet Union. His approval ratings were high, and his Democratic opponent, George McGovern, was struggling in the polls. There seemed to be no reason for Nixon's campaign to resort to illegal activities. Yet that's exactly what they did. As Woodward and Bernstein dug deeper, they discovered that the Watergate break-in was not an isolated incident. It was part of a broader pattern of political espionage and dirty tricks orchestrated by Nixon's re-election committee. The burglars were attempting to plant listening devices in the Democratic headquarters and photograph sensitive documents. They had actually broken into the Watergate complex once before, in May, but returned because some of their surveillance equipment wasn't working properly. The 2 reporters followed a complex money trail that led from the burglars' pockets back to Nixon's campaign finance committee. They discovered that one of the arrested men had a check for $25,000 that had been donated to Nixon's campaign. This was the first concrete evidence linking the break-in to the president's re-election effort. But it was just the beginning. Working with a secret source they called Deep Throat, Woodward and Bernstein slowly uncovered a web of corruption that reached into the highest levels of the Nixon administration. Deep Throat, whose identity remained a mystery for over 30 years, provided crucial guidance that helped the reporters navigate the complex conspiracy. He would later be revealed as Mark Felt, the associate director of the FBI. The Nixon administration initially dismissed the break-in as a third-rate burglary and denied any connection to the president or his campaign. Press Secretary Ron Ziegler called the Post's reporting shabby journalism and accused the newspaper of practicing character assassination. Nixon himself declared that no one in his administration was involved in the break-in. But the cover-up was already underway. Behind the scenes, Nixon and his closest advisors were working frantically to contain the damage. They paid hush money to the burglars to keep them quiet, destroyed evidence, and used government agencies like the CIA and FBI to obstruct the investigation. Nixon's White House counsel, John Dean, later testified that there was a cancer on the presidency as the cover-up grew larger and more desperate. The story might have ended there if not for the persistence of the press and the determination of Congress to get to the truth. In February 1973, the Senate established the Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, chaired by Senator Sam Ervin of North Carolina. The Ervin Committee, as it became known, began holding televised hearings that captivated the American public. Day after day, Americans watched as witnesses testified about a culture of corruption and abuse of power in the Nixon White House. They learned about a secret White House unit called the Plumbers, whose job was to stop information leaks by any means necessary. The Plumbers had broken into the office of Daniel Ellsberg, psychiatrist, seeking damaging information about the man who had leaked the Pentagon Papers. The most damaging testimony came from John Dean, who had been Nixon's White House counsel and was deeply involved in the cover-up. In June 1973, Dean testified for 5 days before the Ervin Committee, methodically laying out the administration's efforts to obstruct justice. He implicated the president directly, testifying that Nixon had discussed using hush money and had approved the cover-up strategy. Nixon denied Dean's allegations, and for months it seemed like a case of he said, she said. Then came the bombshell that would seal Nixon's fate. Alexander Butterfield, a former White House aide, revealed that Nixon had installed a secret recording system in the Oval Office. Every conversation the president had in his office had been recorded. The tapes would either prove Nixon's innocence or confirm his guilt. Both the Senate committee and Special Prosecutor Leon Jaworski demanded access to the tapes. Nixon refused, claiming executive privilege. The battle over the tapes went all the way to the Supreme Court, which ruled unanimously in July 1974 that the president had to turn over the recordings. Nixon had no choice but to comply. When the tapes were finally released, they contained devastating evidence of Nixon's involvement in the cover-up. In a recording from June 23, 1972, just 6 days after the break-in, Nixon could be heard approving a plan to have the CIA tell the FBI to back off the Watergate investigation for national security reasons. This became known as the smoking gun tape, providing clear evidence that the president had obstructed justice. But perhaps even more damaging than the criminal evidence was what the tapes revealed about Nixon's character. Americans heard their president using profanity, making racist comments, and displaying a paranoid, vindictive personality. The image of the presidency was forever tarnished. Nixon had always cultivated an image as a law-and-order president, but the tapes showed him to be lawless and disorderly. As the evidence mounted, Nixon's political support crumbled. Even loyal Republicans began calling for his resignation or impeachment. In July 1974, the House Judiciary Committee approved 3 articles of impeachment against the president: obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. It was clear that the full House would vote to impeach and that the Senate would likely convict him. Facing certain impeachment and removal from office, Nixon made one last desperate attempt to save his presidency. He released edited transcripts of some of the tapes, hoping to control the narrative. But the transcripts only made things worse, revealing the crude and calculating nature of the president's conversations. Even the edited versions contained frequent references to expletive deleted, showing Americans a side of their president they had never seen before. On August 5, 1974, Nixon released the smoking gun tape, and his remaining support in Congress evaporated overnight. Republican leaders, including Senator Barry Goldwater and House Minority Leader John Rhodes, visited the White House to tell Nixon that he had no chance of surviving an impeachment trial. They advised him to resign for the good of the country and the Republican Party. Nixon spent his final days in office in isolation, drinking heavily and talking to the portraits of former presidents that hung in the White House. His family urged him to fight on, but even they could see that the end was inevitable. The man who had achieved the highest office in the land was about to become the first president in American history to resign in disgrace. On the evening of August 8, 1974, Richard Nixon addressed the nation from the Oval Office. In a speech that was watched by 110 million Americans, he announced his resignation, effective the following day. He admitted to making some wrong judgments but stopped short of accepting full responsibility for Watergate. "I have never been a quitter," he said, but he was leaving office because he no longer had the political support necessary to govern effectively. The next morning, Nixon said goodbye to his staff in an emotional ceremony in the White House East Room. He spoke about his father's lemon ranch and his mother, whom he called a saint. He urged his staff to never hate their opponents and to remember that only if you have been in the deepest valley can you ever know how magnificent it is to be on the highest mountain. Then he walked to Marine One helicopter with his wife Pat, turned and gave his trademark victory sign, and flew away from the White House forever. At 12:03 p.m. on August 9, 1974, Gerald Ford was sworn in as the 38th President of the United States. In his first address as president, Ford declared that our long national nightmare is over. A month later, he pardoned Nixon for any crimes he might have committed while in office, a controversial decision that likely cost Ford the 1976 election but was later viewed by many as necessary for the country's healing. The Watergate scandal had profound and lasting effects on American politics and society. It shattered the public's trust in government and the presidency. Before Watergate, most Americans had faith in their institutions and leaders. After Watergate, skepticism and cynicism became the norm. The scandal also led to significant reforms, including campaign finance laws, ethics rules for government officials, and greater oversight of intelligence agencies. Watergate proved that no one, not even the President of the United States, is above the law. It showed that the American system of checks and balances could work, even when tested by the highest levels of corruption. The press played a crucial role in exposing the truth, earning new respect for investigative journalism. Congress demonstrated that it could fulfill its constitutional duty to hold the executive branch accountable. But Watergate also revealed the fragility of democratic institutions. It showed how easily power could be abused and how close America had come to having a president who believed he was above the law. Nixon's famous statement that when the president does it, that means it's not illegal represented a fundamental misunderstanding of American democracy and the rule of law. The 5 men who broke into the Watergate complex on that June night in 1972 set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately strengthen American democracy, but not before severely testing it. Their arrest led to the exposure of crimes and abuses that went far beyond a simple break-in. It revealed a presidency corrupted by power and paranoia, and it reminded Americans that eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. Richard Nixon died in 1994. 20 years after his resignation. By then, many Americans had come to view him as a tragic figure, a brilliant politician whose dark side ultimately destroyed him. His resignation letter, just 1 sentence long, sits in the National Archives as a reminder of one of the most dramatic moments in American political history. Watergate remains a defining moment that changed forever how Americans view their government and their leaders.